Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I know that in my last video I said I was going to upload more and it's been like 2 months and I haven't uploaded a single video, but that's because I got a Christmas temporary retail job. I was very busy and very tired, so that's why I haven't uploaded for the last couple of months, but that just ended on Friday and I'm now unemployed once more. So I am looking for new jobs, but in the meantime I want to get back into making YouTube videos. So hopefully for the next month or so you might actually get some content. The one video that I just couldn't not make was my favourite books of 2022, and 2022 was absolutely my best year of reading. I read 112 books, which is absolutely wild. In 2021 I read 44 books, if I remember correctly, and I thought that was incredible. And then I really blew that out of the park this year. So I felt like I couldn't not make this video reflecting on my year of reading. But as I said, because I read 112 books, I have a lot of them to talk about. So I'm going to try not to ramble too much and just get straight into things. I'm going to split this video into 3 sections. Firstly, I want to share with you some of my stats about the kind of books I was reading. Secondly, I will tell you about my top 8 fiction books that I absolutely love this year, which will be ranked from number 8 to number 1. And then I have another 8 non-fiction books to talk to you about, which I'm going to do in categories, because it's really hard to rank non-fiction books when they're all about completely different topics. It's really hard to compare them to each other. So those I'm just going to do by like topics, but my fiction books will be ranked. Let's jump into the first section of the video and talk about my stats for 2022 and what kind of books I was reading. So firstly, let's start with talking about the genre and the type of books that I was reading. So this year I read 81 fiction books, 28 non-fiction books, and 3 poetry books. This is a lot more fiction than I've read in previous years. The last few years I'd say I had like a 50-50 split of fiction and non-fiction, whereas you can see this year it was way more fiction. But I still read 28 non-fiction books, which is still a lot of non-fiction. And then in terms of fiction, the genres that I was reading actually really shocked me, because apparently the 2 most common genres that I read were thriller mystery and romance, which I really wouldn't say are my favourite genres. But I think it's because these genres are like really easy reading or easy listening. I find I read a lot of audiobooks and sometimes I'm just looking for something easy to entertain me while I'm going about my day. This is definitely something that I want to change going forward into 2023, because the fact that thriller, mystery and romance and even YA are not genres that I love. They're okay and I would like to read some of them this year, but I don't want them to be these huge chunks of my pie. In 2023, the genres that I want to read are contemporary, historical and classics. They're the ones that I tend to give high ratings to, and I just want to make more time for those genres in the new year. And then all those other little yellow bits at the end are all just the others. So that includes historical, sci-fi, children's classics, graphic novels, short stories and horror. So I've just put them there because otherwise if I included all the labels the graph was going to be a mess. And then I did the same thing for non-fiction. So as you can see, memoir, autobiography is by far my biggest non-fiction chunk. And then in terms of my biggest non-fiction categories, I then split them into like what topics am I actually reading about. I read 4 books about minimalism, which surprised me. I didn't think I'd read that many, but I do love minimalism, although I kind of think I've learned all there is to learn, so I don't think I'll be reading any more in a rush. And then I read 4 books about prison reform, which sounds absolutely random, but it's just a political topic that I am fascinated by. And then we have 3 that I called smart thinking. This is what Waterstones calls all of the books that are like politics or kind of the more self-help that's more about like productivity, that kind of stuff. It's really hard to categorize books sometimes, so a lot of them end up just being categorized as smart thinking because they're about, you know, how to be more productive, how to be a better person, how to make the world a better place, that kind of thing. And then my other topics included self-care, sustainability, veganism, feminism, politics and philosophy. And again, here it's really hard to categorize some of these books because they could go into 3 or 4 different categories, but when I look at this list of the topics that I'm reading, I'm like, yeah, that sums up me and my interests. And I feel like if you know me in real life, you'll be like, yeah, those all sound like very Louise topics, so I'm really not mad about this breakdown at all. Okay, next up, my next graph is my rating of books, which I've done as a bar chart because that visually makes more sense to me. As you can see, it is pretty much a bell curve. I rarely finish a book if I think I'm going to give it 2 stars or less, which is why there's so few books that are 2 stars or less. One of my goals for next year is to really push that a little bit further to the right, because I just want to read more incredible books, you know? There's only about a dozen books that I gave 4.55 stars, and given I read 112 books, I want that to be higher. So my goal for this year is absolutely to read quality over quantity, because I find a lot of the books that I give 5 stars are the big chunky books that are either like 500-page historical fictions, or they are, you know, really dense non-fictions, and I find myself avoiding those because they're long. But I really want to try and just read those and accept that my reading is going to be slower. I'm going to finish less books, but I'm going to love more books. So that's my goal for 2023. Then I recorded a little bit of data about the authors that I was reading. You can see that I was mostly reading female authors, and then the other little pieces were, there was a couple of books that were written by both a man and a woman, you know, when they write together. There was a couple of non-binary authors, and then there was a couple of NAs, because they were like various authors, like poetry collections or essay collections, where I couldn't really categorize them, so I just put NA. But as you can see, this is my split, and you know what, as a woman, I'm pretty happy with this. I'm pretty happy to be reading mostly female. I feel like I read a lot of male authors, but this reassures me that I don't, because I'm here for the female experience. And then I also recorded author nationality. So as you can see, by far my biggest chunk is American. And then we have British, obviously, which makes sense because I am British. And then Australian, again, I think just because it's a very white English-speaking country, probably makes sense why I'm encountering a lot of Australian authors. Israeli American was just Leigh Bardugo. I read 4 books by Leigh Bardugo, so that's why she's there. And then Swedish is just Fredrik Backman, because I read 4 books by him. And then we have loads of other nationalities. Really hard to avoid American and British authors because they are the books that are most popular, which obviously is not the best thing in the world. So with that in mind, I'm pretty happy with the split, and I think it's kind of how I want to keep things, you know? I do want to read from other nationalities, and as you can see, I say like a quarter to a third of my authors are other nationalities, so it's not like I'm not reading from other people. I'm aware that I am still mainly reading American and British authors, but I say it's hard to avoid. My reading goals currently are to read the books that I have been on my TBR for forever, you know, and those are going to be those authors. So maybe in the future one day I will make a goal to read more non-Western centric books, but currently I'm pretty happy with the split as it is. And then the next thing that I recorded was the format in which I read the book. So as you can see, over half of the books that I read were either an audiobook, or I had the audiobook and the print book, or and the ebook, which really summarizes my reading year. When people ask me how I read so many books this year, this is 100% the answer. Like, I just read audiobooks. And the way that I've made this feasible, because I know audiobooks can be expensive, is BorrowBox, which is connected to my library account, and you can get free audiobooks through your library. I'm planning to make a video in the near future talking about how I read so many books. And really this is my answer. It's A, audiobooks, but B, reading a variety of types, because different types of books suit different moods and different times. So I'll talk more about that in another video, but this really makes sense to me. And then I also kept track of where I was getting these books from, which I called the source. So you can see most of them are BorrowBox, which is that audiobook app that I told you about. You can also get ebooks on there, but I don't really like it for ebooks because I don't like the format of you have to like read them in the app, and it's not the best. It's not as nice as Kindle. So for ebooks, I tend to read Kindle, and then we have books from the library, we have books from Waterstones, and then we have books from Scribd, which is another like ebook audiobook app. And then there's a whole load of other things, which is just like charity shops, Depop. So a lot of them where I got them from multiple formats. So if I'm reading the audiobook and the ebook, it would be, you know, BorrowBox plus Kindle. That's got its own little slice. So that's what all those other slices are. But as you can see, I really am getting most of my books from BorrowBox, Kindle, and the library, which is great because none of those things involve bringing physical books into my life, which as a minimalist is great. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into the section of this video that we're all most excited about, which is my favourite fiction books of 2022 ranked. As I said earlier, I read 81 fiction books this year, so this is the top 10% of those. There were other books that I read that I also loved, but I'm only sharing with you the ones that I gave 4.5 or 5 stars to. So, without further ado, in 8th place, the 8th best book that I read this year, that absolutely I did not expect to be on this list, was One True Loves by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I read first Evelyn Hugo and Daisy Jones and the Six, and I didn't love those books. I didn't mind them, but I didn't love them. But then I decided to go back and read some of her older books, which tend to be more like contemporary romance books. And the thing that made me really interested in these is these all have really interesting premises, and I think that's why I love this book so much. This is not a spoiler, you find this all out within either on the blurb or within like the first chapter, but the premise of this book is that a woman is happily married to a man, they're very much in love, and the man is a wildlife photographer, and he goes off on this expedition and there's a helicopter crash and he seemingly dies. And she is obviously grieving, but then eventually she moves on with her life and she ends up rekindling a relationship with her childhood sweetheart, with sort of her high school sweetheart, and they end up getting together. And then her husband reappears. He did not die, he was still alive. And so she has to choose between her husband and her childhood sweetheart, who she's recently fallen back in love with. And it's just such an interesting premise. I love putting main characters in really difficult situations like this, especially in romance books. And it just was really interesting, and I thought it was really well done. The writing really held up. It's a good mixture of romance and serious topics. And I was really happy with the resolution of this difficult situation. I've read One True Loves and Maybe in Another Life of her backlist, both of which I really liked, but this one I just liked a bit more than Maybe in Another Life. But both of them set up these really interesting premises, but then gave you a really satisfactory answer, because that feels like an impossible situation to be in and an impossible thing to have to decide. But actually by the time you get to the end of the book, you're like, yeah, that is the correct answer. It was a very quick read. I think I listened to this as an audiobook in 1 or 2 days, so I flew through it, but I just really enjoyed it. In 7th place we have The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, but particularly the version I read, which was the illustrated edition by Mina Lima, is the name of the illustrator, because that just brought this book to life in such an incredible way. She has illustrated this series of children's classics, which are just incredible, and I definitely want to read more of them. But I decided to pick this one because it's a story I didn't actually know. She's done like Beauty and the Beast and Peter Pan and Ariel, but I obviously know those stories from the Disney movies, but this one I didn't know the story of, so I thought it would be a really interesting book to read. And it's just such a lovely story about children connecting and growing through nature. I think if I hadn't read the illustrated version, I would have given it 3.5, 4 stars, but I gave it 4.5 stars in the end because the illustrations were just incredible. So that's what I'm saying, my rating, and the reason it's in my top books is because of the illustrated edition. I'll see if I can find some online to include on the screen because they just brought it to life. And this book is also interactive, so some of the pages have like pop-ups and things, which are just really fun. There weren't as many of those in the book as I expected. For like a 500-page book, there's only like 10 pop-ups, but there are loads of normal illustrations, and those are stunning, so it really doesn't matter too much. But yeah, I absolutely loved this edition. The only real issue I had with this book, and one of the reasons why I didn't give it 5 stars, is because there's a big theme of manifestation and getting what you want by manifesting things, which is not something I really believe in, especially the way it's done in this book, where it does seem to be this magical thing, and I didn't love that. So that was one of the reasons that it didn't quite get 5 stars from me. Next up, in 6th position, we have another children's classic, which is Anne of Green Gables, and this year I read the graphic novel version illustrated by Brenna Fumler, which was just stunning. I read this book when I was like 10, so I have technically read it, but that was a very long time ago. But I decided to read the graphic novel because I think I had Kindle Unlimited at the time, and it was on Kindle Unlimited, so I was like, well, I'll give it a read because I'm really interested in Brenna Fumler's work. I keep hearing a lot about her, and so I thought I'll give this a go, and it was stunning. So again, this is a book where it's on this list because of the art more so than because of the writing, but it was just stunning. Again, I'll see if I can include some illustrations on the screen, but there were 1 or 2 illustrations where I just stopped and looked at them and was like, this is beautiful. And obviously it's a very sweet story. I do want to reread the actual book at some point this year or in the next year or so. So for Christmas I did actually ask for a copy of the normal book. I got this really fun Penguin Classics Deluxe edition, which I just think has a really cool cover. So it's just a normal book inside, but it just has a wonderful cover. So I'm going to try and read this at some point this year, and read the actual original text, which I read when I was like 10, but I haven't read since then. And then in number 5, sticking with the classics theme, as you can see, 2022 was really the year that I started reading and falling in love with classic books, was Little Women. I absolutely loved this book. I think it's probably one of my favourite classics that I've read so far. I'm not sure I've read anything else that tops it. It is a slow book and it is long, but it's just beautiful. And I think especially because I'd seen the 2020 film, I could conjure those images in my head, and so it was really easy for me to visualise what was going on. And I do love the film. It's definitely one of my favourite period drama films of all time, especially because it has Timothée Chalamet, Florence Pugh and Saoirse Ronan and Emma Watson. It just has an incredible cast and it's an incredible film, and the book is just as wonderful. So that's what I would say. I think a lot of people have seen the film, and I think if you enjoyed the film, you will enjoy the book. They feel very similar in their vibes, and I really enjoyed reading this. In 4th place, we have another romance, which again blows my mind, but we have Red, White and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, which I picked up thinking, lol, this will be a fun time, and secretly actually loved it. And then I bullied my flatmate into reading it because I was like, you will love this and I need someone to love it as much as I've loved it. And the way I pitched this to her is I was like, it's just fan fiction that's well written and complete. I can see why it's had criticism for that, but personally I loved it. It's got that romance, it's got that impossible situation because it is about a fictional Prince of England dating a fictional son of the president in America, which is just, again, I love a good romance with an impossible, difficult situation. I love putting my romance characters into very difficult situations, but it's just really well written and it was funny. There were so many moments that made me laugh out loud, especially there's a lot of the book that's like their email exchange, and those just made me cackle because they were all just hilarious. And there's also like 4 or 5 side characters who, you know, you get to know and fall in love with as well. Just a really lovely group of characters. If you grew up reading fan fiction, or if you like Heartstopper, something like that, I would really recommend giving this a try. And then in 3rd place, we're really getting close now, we have Home Before Dark by Riley Sager. Now, I don't know if my review of this book is biased by the fact that it was the first thriller that I read this year. And this year was really, again, the year that I got into thrillers. I hadn't read many thrillers before this year, and this was the first one that I read. So I don't know if my review is biased by the fact that it was one of the first thrillers that I read and I didn't have others to compare it to, but I remember I just devoured this. So our main character, when he was a child, him and his family lived in a haunted house for a couple of months, and then they flee because it's haunted, and his dad writing a book about their experience living in a haunted house. And he, for his entire life, never really knows whether this was true or not. So his dad writes this non-fiction book claiming that it's happened. But as I said, our main character, the child, was a child at the time, so he doesn't really remember what was true or not. So he spends his whole life wondering whether this house was really haunted or not. And then we get to like the start of the book. This is all kind of before the book takes place. The dad dies, which is very unfortunate, obviously, but in the will, turns out they still own the haunted house. So the son, our main character, decides he's going to go back there and renovate the house and sell it. And what's really interesting about this book is that we switch in chapters between following our main character in the present day as he's renovating this house, and then we also get glimpses of this book that the dad wrote, and the two kind of link. We're learning things in one that influence the other, and it's just really, really well done. This is really similar in feel to Verity by Colleen Hoover. If you liked Verity by Colleen Hoover, please read this. It's very similar in premise, but just so much better in my opinion. But as I say, I don't know if I just have really good memories of this because it was the first thriller I read and I was in need of some escapism, and I read it so fast. So I have incredible memories of this book, and I just absolutely loved it. It's just a really well-paced thriller. I really enjoyed the fact that we were going between these two books because it was so interesting to watch things happen in one and be like, oh my god, that's gonna happen. I think there were one too many twists at the end, which Riley Sager loves to do. He loves to put like 4 twists in the last chapter, which I think was a little unnecessary, but it was a very interesting ending and not what I saw coming. So I really liked that. And then my top 2 books of the year, which are by the same author, so I think I've officially found a new favourite author. In 2nd place, we have All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. And it's the first book I had read in so long that reminded me just why I love reading. You know, when you read a book and you're like, this is it. And this is what I'm saying I want to read more of this year, because All the Light We Cannot See is a historical fiction book set in World War II. I seem to really love books set in World War II. I think it's because World War II adds so much tension and puts our characters in such a difficult situation, as we've seen, I love. And so it provides a really tense backdrop for a story to take place. I think that's why I love World War II books, because so many of my favourite books are set in World War II. It's not because I'm glamorising war, I'm very against war. But I think I just love a really difficult situation for my characters, apparently. But it's about a young girl who is blind and how she navigates the world, and that's just told in a really compelling and almost poetic way without romanticising blindness too much. Her father or her grandfather builds her a little model city that she can feel to memorise the routes. And so that's just a really interesting story about her navigating the war while being blind. And then our other character is a young boy who wants to be an engineer, which, as someone, I am an engineer, I just obviously rooted for him and found it really interesting, and he wants to be an electrical engineer. And again, just the way he talks about electricity is really poetic and really magical, and you can tell that he finds the electricity magical and interesting and just so well written. That's the thing with this book, it's just so well written. I don't know if I was happy with the ending of this book, but it was so well written that I gave it 5 stars. Anyway, I don't want to say too much more without spoiling it. Please, if you love a good, well-written literary historical novel, give this one a go. If you enjoyed The Book Thief, would really recommend this. And then, because I'd read that book and absolutely loved it, I obviously wanted to read Anthony Doerr's latest release, which is Cloud Cuckoo Land. This is a book that I think a lot of people have been scared off of because the premise is a bit wild. And I admit I was too, but then I saw it on sale in my Waterstones and I was like, well, I'm just going to pick it up and give it a go. I think it's the one book I actually have here that I can show you. And as I say, I think a lot of people are put off by A, the size, it is 600 pages, and B, the premise. The premise is absolutely wild. We are following 5 characters across 3 timelines. We have 2 characters who are set in the past, in the Siege of Constantinople, which is something I know nothing about and still know nothing about having read this book. But because we're following 2 characters, we're very much seeing their day-to-day lives, so you don't need to know much about history to appreciate their storylines. And then we have 2 characters who are in the present day, slightly in the past, but not, relatively in the present day. And then we have 1 character in the future. So it's a really interesting book. But the main thing that links all of their stories together is Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is a fictional Greek tragedy that the author has created for this book. And we see all of these characters interact with that story either because they discover it, or they love it, or they read it and they find it really interesting, etc, etc, etc. And so a lot of this book is about books and forgotten books and libraries, but it's also about friendship and survival and what it means to live a good, meaningful life. And I just loved it. I think it's very character driven, I would say. I loved all the characters in this book. As I say, it's a really difficult book to pitch because it has such an interesting premise. But the main way I would pitch it is I would say, if you've read All the Light We Cannot See, which is a very popular book, and you've been thinking about reading this, please read it. Because if you liked one, you will like the other. So don't be put off by the premise. If you liked All the Light We Cannot See and you're interested in checking out more of Anthony Doerr's work, please read this. This is absolutely the best book I have read in a long time. Okay, so that is all of my fiction books. Now let's quickly talk about non-fiction books. As I said, these aren't ranked, instead I've sorted them by category because it's really difficult to rank non-fiction books, especially when they're all about such different topics. So let's start by talking about memoirs, as that was the biggest slice of my non-fiction pie. Firstly, I just really want to quickly mention I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jennette McCurdy. I'm not going to talk too much about this book because everyone and their cat and their mother has recommended this book, but it just is really interesting and really well written. I grew up watching Nickelodeon and iCarly and Drake and Josh and Victorious, and so it's really interesting to learn what it was like behind the scenes on a show that at the time I didn't even think. I was a child when I watched this. I never even thought about what those experiences were like for the actors. So it's really interesting to hear about what her experience was like. And she does touch on some really serious topics, so it's worth checking the trigger warnings for, especially for eating disorders and domestic abuse. But just really well written. And just fascinating to learn about. I seem to find it really interesting to read memoirs and autobiographies about women who had difficult childhoods, which is what all three of the memoirs that I'm going to talk to you about are. So it's no surprise that I found that one really interesting. The second one that I read this year, and probably of the three of these, the one that I would most recommend, is Unorthodox by Deborah Feldman. She grew up in a Hasidic Jewish community, which was quite an extreme community, almost cult-like, in Brooklyn, New York. And it's about her growing up in that environment and what it was like, and why she eventually decides to leave and what leaving is like. And what I will say is that if you enjoyed reading Educated by Tara Westover, this book had scarily similar themes. And it's wild to me that these people growing up in all these different extremist communities that feel very different on the surface, actually the underlying themes and the reasons that people leave are often the same. In Educated, it's about Tara's lack of education and her lack of rights, and here those two things are true. And then the last memoir, is it a memoir that I wanted to mention, is a essay collection called What My Mother and I Don't Talk About, which is one of those books that I read the title and was like, a book for me. But it is just a series of 10 or 12 authors, I can't remember exactly, writing essays with the, prompt, What My Mother and I Don't Talk About. And pretty much all of these authors are talking about their experience in hindsight, which I think is something that I am finding really interesting now that I no longer live with my parents. Looking at these experiences in hindsight is fascinating. So if you have a difficult relationship with your mother, or if you just love reading books about people who have difficult relationships with their mother, this book made me cry, and I gave it 5 stars, and I would highly recommend it. And it's about such a variety of topics. Like, I think Andre Hesselman's one is actually about the fact that his mother, he gets on with his mother fine, but his mother is deaf, so they can't talk. So that was just a really interesting take on that prompt. But they're all about such different situations. Some about, I think, like struggling to be accepted by their parents because of LGBTQ reasons and similar things, or just domestic abuse, having abusive mothers. So a whole array of situations, but beautifully written, fascinating series of essays. The next topic that I have a couple of books about is prison reform. As I said, this year I actually read 4 books about prison reform, which may seem random, but is a political topic that I am fascinated by. It surprises me that this isn't a more talked about topic, because it's so important and so serious and so current and prevalent that I don't understand why we aren't talking about this. But the 2 books that I read this year on the topic that I found incredible. Firstly, we have The New Jim Crow. That is basically a textbook on prison reform. If you're looking for a really informative, comprehensive text on this issue, that is the book that I would recommend, because it's still readable, but it's very dense with information and with sources and examples. I listened to it as an audiobook. I think it's a little bit too informative, personally, and so it's probably not the best primer on this topic, but if you're looking, I say, for almost a textbook on this topic, that's still readable, that is definitely the place to go. And then the other book that I read, which I actually read at the very start of this year, but has just stuck with me in my brain, is a book called A Bit of a Stretch by a guy called Chris Atkins. So he is a journalist and documentary filmmaker, and he was arrested, I can't remember when, a while ago, for, I think for embezzling funds, a very white collar crime. And he gets sent to spend, I think he has to do a year of prison, but he actually ends up doing 6 months in a normal prison and then 6 months in an open prison. And this book is about his time doing those 6 months in prison. He himself is not treated too badly, but he sees how other people are treated, and he sees just the lack of resources and the lack of help that the other prisoners are given. And so I think he felt that he was like, I've only spent 6 months in prison and I had such a harrowing time and I saw such harrowing things that I have to write about it and I have to share it with the world. And that's exactly what he's done. It's a harrowing book to read. There were some really difficult passages. There was 1 or 2 that I just had to skip because they were too graphic. But it just shows you what our prison system is like. And it's about the UK prison system as well, in particular, which is obviously interesting because I am from Britain and a lot of these texts are about the American prison system. But this book shows you that it's another case of things are not better in the UK, or if they are better, only marginally so. Things are still awful in the UK, and we really need to think about why we put people in prison, and if that's the best thing to do. Okay, and then on to marginally happier topics. The last topic that I wanted to talk to you about is veganism and sustainability, and I have 3 books that really stood out to me this year. So the first book that I read was This is Vegan Propaganda by Ed Winters. Ed Winters is a vegan activist who I've been following for a couple of years now, basically since I went plant-based myself. And he wrote a book this year called This is Vegan Propaganda, which is basically a comprehensive guide to veganism and why you should go vegan. He talks about so many different angles. He talks about animal rights, he talks about the climate, he talks about human welfare. So he really covers everything. If anything, I think it was too comprehensive. It could have been a little bit shorter. I wouldn't recommend this as the first book you read about veganism. This is not that book. This is a book for someone who is already halfway there, wants to learn more, or someone who's already all the way there, someone is vegan and they just want to get better at talking to their relatives. Okay, and then the next book that I have is The Story of Stuff by Annie Leonard, and it did take me a couple of months to read it start to finish, but I highlighted it, I annotated it, I took notes, and again, this is another book that is just a comprehensive, informative Bible. But this one is all about recycling and waste and production, which is a topic that I am fascinated by as an engineer. And the thing that got me into sustainability was thinking about waste and production. If you're looking for a nice text about why our recycling system is broken, would highly recommend giving that a read. And then finally, the last book that I want to talk to you about is Utopia for Realists by Rutger Bregman. This is more of a political book. And again, this is a book that took me a couple of months to read, but that I highlighted, annotated, took notes on. You can see if I flick through, there's all kinds of highlighting and annotating in here. And I took really comprehensive notes on it because it is fascinating. So this book is exactly what it says it is. It is Rutger Bregman's suggestions for how we can make the world a better place that are realistic and research based. And spoiler alert, you can't really spoil non-fiction, so I'm going to tell you, but the main ideas that he presents for the things that he thinks would make the world a better place are universal basic income, a 15-hour work week, and open borders, which all sound like very radical ideas, especially as someone who grew up in a right-wing leaning family. Those feel like very radical ideas to me. But once you read this book, you're like, these ideas aren't radical at all. These would make the world a better place. So if you're looking for a book about politics and about how we can make the world a better place and what we can actually do to make the world a better place, would highly, highly recommend this. As I say, I feel like I could talk about all of these books so much more, but I don't want this video to be 2 hours long, so I've only given you a brief summary and review of each book, but all of these books I loved with my whole heart and could talk about for hours, and it's been really difficult not to. But yes, those are my reading stats for 2022 and my favourite books of this year. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope that it's not 2 hours long by the time I've edited it. And I hope that I will be making lots more content for you and that I will see you soon. Please let me know in the comments what your favourite books were of this year. I would love to know, and let me know if you have any recommendations for me based on the books that I've mentioned. And please don't forget to subscribe if you aren't already. Like I said, I really want to try and put effort into this channel for at least the next couple of months while I'm not working or until I get a new job, and hopefully I will see you very soon. Thank you for watching.